They say, sometimes the quietest voices carry the loudest truths. This is not just a story about a boy or a dog. It's about how healing can come in the most unexpected form. What if I told you that an 8-year-old boy who couldn't read found his voice through a dog who never barked? That a misunderstood pit bull named Bear became the lifeline in a snowstorm no one saw coming? This video holds a message so powerful, so deeply human, it just might stay with you long after it ends. So please, watch till the very last second. And if it touches you, subscribe and be part of this journey of meaningful storytelling. The snow was falling hard that evening, blanketing the Vermont forest in silence and white. The wind howled through the pines like a warning, a cry of something lost. Flashlights danced across the snowdrifts as people shouted into the cold. "Logan! Logan, can you hear me?" The voices cracked from exhaustion, fear, and the bitter cold. It had been over 2 hours since the boy had disappeared, 8 years old, last seen heading toward the old shed near the edge of the woods. Just a few moments, his father had said. He turned away for just a few moments. Now those few moments had stretched into darkness. The search party moved in a desperate rhythm, calling the boy's name again and again, their boots crunching through knee-deep snow. One volunteer slipped and cursed under his breath. Another wiped his foggy glasses and pressed on. The temperature had already dropped below 20 degrees. If they didn't find the child soon, the snow would claim him before they did. Suddenly a sound tore through the white stillness. A bark, not the frightened yelp of a dog trapped or cold. This was sharp, intentional, and loud enough to cut through the storm like a bell. One of the searchers froze. "Did you hear that?" Another bark echoed, closer this time, urgent and strong. Then came the blur of movement. A dog, a pit bull, burst through the tree line, his muscular body coated in frost, eyes blazing with purpose. He wasn't running aimlessly. He was following something, or perhaps leading someone. "Is that Bear?" someone shouted. It was the dog no one trusted, the one who had been sitting quietly at the shelter just that morning, the one people still looked sideways at, whispering words like dangerous and unpredictable. Bear didn't pause for permission. He leapt over a fallen log and dove into a narrow pass between two large rocks. His barks now came faster, more insistent. A man with a red parka rushed to follow him, and that's when they saw it. Nestled under the ledge of a frozen outcrop, half buried in snow, was a small figure. His jacket had frosted over, his mittens soaked. One boot had come loose and was dangling off his foot. His lips were blue. His eyes closed. "Logan," the man yelled, dropping to his knees. The boy didn't respond, but there was breath. Shallow, fragile, but there. Another rescuer called for medical assistance over the radio. They wrapped Logan in emergency blankets, whispering his name, willing him to open his eyes. And Bear simply lay beside him, curling his body into the boy's side, his breath warming the boy's cheeks, refusing to leave. By the time the paramedics arrived, Bear was covered in snow, but his body never moved an inch. Not until Logan was lifted onto the stretcher did Bear finally stand, tail low, ears down, as if reluctant to let go. The rescue workers gave each other stunned looks. No one could understand how the dog had found him. There were no footprints, no scent trails visible through the snow. Just silence, and then the box. It was almost impossible. Back at the town's community center, people gathered in stunned silence as Logan was taken to the hospital for recovery. "How did the dog know where he was?" someone finally asked. The crowd turned to the woman who'd entered the room behind the medics, gray-haired, wrapped in a worn green coat, her hands shaking with emotion. She was the one who'd brought the dog to the library 6 months ago. The one who everyone thought was just a lonely old woman with strange ideas. Her name was Margaret, and her voice cracked as she answered. Because for the last 6 months, that little boy read to him every Saturday for 30 minutes, no matter the weather. He read to Bear when he could barely pronounce a word. Bear listened when no one else did. The room fell silent again, not in confusion this time, but in recognition. Something had passed between that boy and that dog, something that books couldn't define but stories could hold. It was then that the local news crew arrived, drawn in by the dramatic rescue. But what they captured wasn't just a miraculous moment. It was the beginning of a deeper story, of connection, patience, and the healing power of being heard. Because Bear wasn't always a hero, and Logan wasn't always brave. They had found each other in a quiet corner of a small town library, both carrying the weight of things unspoken. And somehow, across pages and pores, they'd taught each other how to be whole again. But before we go back to the start, before the library, the books, the whispered words over story time, we pause here, in the snow, in the stillness after a boy is saved. In the warmth of a dog who refused to give up. Because sometimes the most incredible stories don't begin in the sunshine. They begin in the cold. With a silence that only love can break, and a bark that leads the way. Bear hadn't always been a dog with sad eyes. Once he'd worn a vest that read "Therapy Dog, Do Not Pet," and walked the shiny halls of a veterans hospital in upstate New York. He was calm, responsive, and endlessly patient. War veterans with tremors and haunting memories had found peace resting a hand on his broad back. One man who hadn't spoken in months once whispered his daughter's name while Bear sat silently beside him. That was Bear's gift. He didn't need to bark or beg for attention. He simply existed with a presence that made people feel safe. But everything changed the day his handler, Captain Ross, lost control of their pickup on a snow-covered road. They were driving home from the hospital, Bear curled in the passenger seat like always. The truck skidded on black ice, hit a tree, and flipped. Captain Ross died at the scene. Bear survived with minor injuries, but something deeper was broken, something you couldn't see on an X-ray. With no family to claim him, Bear was sent to a county-run rescue shelter on the outskirts of a cold New England town. No more hospital hallways, no more human touch. No more purpose. The shelter wasn't cruel, but it was crowded. Barking echoed day and night. Puppies yelped for attention. Larger dogs growled behind steel grates. And Bear did none of those things. He lay on his thin blanket, his face always turned toward the small window, as if waiting for a familiar voice that would never return. He didn't eat much. The staff tried warm meals, even bacon bits, but Bear only picked at his food. He didn't play with the others, and when potential adopters came by looking for family-friendly dogs or Instagram-ready pups, Bear didn't even lift his head. Some labeled him depressed. Others said he was broken. But the truth was simpler. Bear was grieving. One Tuesday afternoon, in early spring, the front door of the shelter opened and brought in a woman most of the staff recognized but hadn't seen in years. Margaret Foster. White hair pulled into a bun, coat buttoned to the neck, and eyes like a sharp wind cutting across the valley. "Is Joe here?" she asked the teenage volunteer at the front desk. Joe was the shelter's senior caretaker. A quiet man with a soft spot for elderly dogs and elderly women, he came out wiping his hands on a towel. "Margaret, what brings you here?" She gave him a tired smile. "I'm looking for a dog." "Not a puppy? Not a showpiece, a listener?" Joe tilted his head. "Listener? I'm starting a read-aloud program at the library for kids who struggle with reading. They'll sit with the dog and read out loud, without fear of being corrected or laughed at. It's part therapy, part literacy." She paused, her voice steady. "I need a dog who understands silence." Joe looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Come with me." They passed kennels filled with dogs that jumped, whined, barked. "He's in the back," Joe said quietly. "Came to us 3 months ago. Ex-therapy dog. Lost his person in a car crash. Margaret stopped in front of a kennel that looked no different than the rest. Inside, lying still with his head resting between his paws, was a solidly built grey and white pit bull. No wagging tail, no curious glance. Just slow breathing and an expression that could break your heart if you let it. Joe opened the gate gently and stepped back. Margaret didn't speak right away. She bent down slowly, so her knees wouldn't give out, and sat cross-legged on the cold concrete floor. Bear's eyes shifted to her. No growl. No reaction, just a glance, then stillness again. She studied him for a long time. And then softly she said, "You look like you've seen loss." Bear blinked. "It stays in the chest, doesn't it? The ache." "Mine's been there for 27 years. Joe, standing nearby, looked puzzled. She nodded slowly. "My son." 19, Marine, never made it back. That was the day I stopped expecting Joy to knock on my door. Bear shifted just a little. His paw twitched. Margaret smiled gently. But here I am, looking for a reason to keep my voice useful. Bear finally looked at her. Not through her, not past her, but at her. A long, deep look. Margaret reached out slowly and placed her hand near his front paw. Not touching, just close enough to feel the warmth. "That's it," she said. "You'll do just fine." The staff was hesitant. A pit bull. With kids. Liability forms were signed. Procedures followed. Margaret agreed to all of it. She bought Bear a thick winter coat, a soft-lined harness, and a quilted dog bed she'd sewn herself. She fed him boiled chicken and rice to ease his stomach. She spoke to him like a roommate rather than a pet. She didn't expect him to perform. She didn't expect anything at all. And Bear, for the first time in months, began to eat. Not much at first, just a few bites, then half a bowl, then full. He followed her around the house, not urgently, but with calm curiosity. He lay near her feet when she wrote letters or drank tea. After 2 weeks, she registered him for the Read to Dogs pilot program at the town library. Children would sign up for 15-minute reading sessions. Nothing formal, just pages, voices, and presence. The library board had doubts. Isn't he too big? A pit bull? What if he gets aggressive? Margaret didn't argue. She simply showed them a Polaroid from the shelter. Bear, sitting quietly by the window, his eyes far away. "He doesn't bark," she said, "but he listens." That was enough. And so, on a quiet Saturday morning, Bear lay down on a soft blanket in the children's corner of the library, next to a small stack of picture books. Outside, snow still clung to the window panes, but inside, warmth had begun its quiet return, not through words spoken, but through the power of being seen. And Bear was ready to listen once more. At 8 years old, Logan had already stopped talking to most people, not because he was shy or stubborn, but because every word felt like walking on broken glass. The letters on the page danced and flipped. Sentences jumbled in his mind like puzzle pieces that never quite fit. Teachers called it dyslexia. Kids at school called him slow. And Logan? Logan didn't call it anything. He just stopped trying. Before the accident, things had been different. His mom had a voice that turned even the driest book into an adventure. She used to read to him every night, sitting on the edge of his bed with a lamp that glowed just enough to light her smile. She made him believe stories could be more real than anything outside their little apartment window. Her favorite was The Velveteen Rabbit, and she always cried at the end, even though she'd read it at least a dozen times. Then came the icy morning in February when the car spun across the highway. It was supposed to be a quick drive to the bookstore for a reading event. Logan survived with a bruised arm and a broken collarbone. His mom didn't. After that, books stopped meaning magic. They meant silence. They meant the sound of a page turning without a voice to guide it. Logan refused to read. At school, he barely spoke above a whisper. His handwriting was shaky, his spelling unreadable. He began to disappear into himself. His father, Kevin, didn't know what to do. A mechanic with calloused hands and a heart that had never been good at words, he did what he knew. He worked. Long hours at the shop, short answers at home. He left food on the table, checked Logan's homework without knowing what to look for, and sat in the living room staring at the television while his son lay awake in silence. They grieved separately, two islands drifting farther apart. When Margaret first called about the Read to Dogs program, Kevin hesitated. He didn't know the woman well, only that she was older, used to run the library, and was known for wearing scarves, no matter the weather. She explained the idea carefully. No pressure, no tests. Just a boy, a dog, and a book, she said. Sometimes reading to someone who doesn't judge is the best way to begin. Kevin didn't argue. He just nodded. And that Saturday morning, he drove Logan to the town library for the first time since the accident. Logan was quiet in the truck, watching the frost snake its way up the window. He didn't ask where they were going. He didn't ask why. When they pulled into the parking lot, he saw a small handmade sign that read, "Read with Bear, a quiet friend awaits." Inside, the children's corner had been transformed. Soft rugs, beanbag chairs, a basket of books, and in the middle of it all, lying calmly on a plaid blanket, was Bear. Logan froze. Kevin stepped behind him. "He's just a dog, buddy. You don't have to stay." But Logan didn't move toward the door. He didn't step forward either. He just stared. Bear didn't bark. Didn't wag, just lifted his head slightly, ears perked, eyes soft, no judgment. No demands. Margaret appeared beside them with a gentle smile. "Would you like to say hello?" Logan looked up, unsure. "He won't ask you any questions," she added. That was enough. He stepped forward slowly. Bear remained still, watching him without expectation. Logan crouched beside him, holding out a cautious hand. Bear leaned forward and sniffed, then rested his chin on his paws again as if to say, "I'm here if you need me, but I won't push." Margaret handed Logan a small paperback book, Henry and Mudge. Simple words, short sentences, friendly pictures. Logan took the book, sat cross-legged beside Bear, and opened to the first page. His lips parted. Nothing came out. He glanced sideways at the dog. Bear's eyes met his and blinked once. Logan tried again. "The dog." His voice cracked like a dry twig. But Bear didn't react. No wince, no correction, just silence and stillness. Logan swallowed and continued. "The dog was big." He paused, looked again. Bear's tail gave the smallest wag. Something inside Logan shifted, not much but just enough. He finished the page. Margaret, seated a few feet away, wiped her glasses, though they weren't dirty. Kevin watched through the glass wall of the library from the hallway, arms folded, not daring to interrupt. After 15 minutes, Logan stood up, handed the book back, and whispered, "Okay." Margaret knelt down beside him. "Would you like to come again next week?" Logan nodded, almost imperceptibly. The next Saturday, he returned, and the next. Each week, he read a little more. His words were slow and uneven, but they came. He brought books from home. Then he started picking his own from the library shelf. One day, he asked if he could write a story just for Bear. The story was about a dog knight who protected a young prince who couldn't speak. The dog didn't fight with teeth or claws, but by listening so hard that the boy found his voice. Margaret printed the story, and Logan illustrated it himself. He stapled it together, titled it Sir Bear the Brave, and placed it gently in the bookshelf next to the real books. It stayed there for weeks. No one at the library said much about it, but one day, a girl with autism sat down to read to Bear, and she chose Logan's book first. At school, Logan still struggled, but now, When the letters danced on the page, he remembered Bear's steady eyes. When he tripped over a word, he heard Margaret's calm voice. He won't laugh. He'll wait. And when he wrote a new story, he imagined Bear curled beside him, listening. Because Bear didn't just help Logan learn to read. He reminded him that words mattered, even when they came out crooked. And that sometimes being heard starts with someone who says nothing at all. At first, Logan had only managed to read a few shaky lines at a time. Words were mountains, and every sentence felt like a storm. But Bear never moved too fast. He waited. And in that waiting, something magical started to happen. Week after week, Logan returned to the library, always to the same quiet corner, always to Bear. The books began to change. No longer simple picture books with oversized fonts, but longer stories, chapter books with real characters and emotions. The boy who used to trip over the word "thee" was now flipping through pages with a kind of cautious confidence. Margaret noticed first. She kept a quiet tally of Logan's progress in a small notebook. Nothing official, just pencil notes beside titles like Frog and Toad, The Boxcar Children, and eventually Charlotte's Web. She never shared them, never announced his victories. But every time Logan read a full paragraph without stopping, she added a tiny star beside his name. But it wasn't just the reading. Logan started writing. At home, with crayons and lined paper, he created stories that featured a brave knight named Sir Bear, also known as the Silent Knight. In Logan's tales, Sir Bear rescued lost children from dark forests, helped them find their voices in kingdoms where no one listened, and defeated invisible dragons called Fear and Doubt. Logan stapled his stories into homemade books and brought one each Saturday to the library. Before reading anything else, he'd open his latest tale, sit beside Bear, and begin. This week, Sir Bear was called to the village of Whisper Hill. Bear would listen, as always, head slightly tilted. Sometimes he'd thump his tail on the carpet when Logan reached the funny part. Sometimes he'd let out a long breath when the prince was in trouble. Once, when Logan read a chapter where Sir Bear lost his way and nearly gave up, Bear rested his head gently on the boy's knee. "See?" Logan whispered. "You do understand." It didn't take long for others to notice the bond. Other children in the reading program began asking if they could read to Bear too. Margaret kept a careful schedule. But Bear was never quite the same with them. He was kind, patient, gentle, but with Logan, he was something else entirely. He was present. Kevin, Logan's father, had started to accompany his son more often. At first, he waited in the truck, engine idling, staring at the clock. Then, he began standing just outside the library doors, arms crossed, watching through the window. One morning, Margaret invited him to come inside. "It's warm," she said, handing him a travel mug of coffee. "And we have chairs now." Kevin sat in the last row of the children's section, next to a display of seasonal books. He didn't say anything. But when Logan opened a book and began reading aloud with barely a pause, Kevin blinked more than usual. It was the first time he had heard his son speak that much since the accident. Over the next several weeks, Kevin became a fixture. He never interrupted, never hovered, just watched, sometimes with a small smile, sometimes with eyes that shined. One day, Logan read an entire story he'd written and illustrated on his own. Kevin clapped the loudest, even though only a few parents were in the room. Afterward, as they walked to the truck, Logan looked up and said, "I think I want to be a writer." Kevin almost stumbled on the sidewalk. "You think so?" Logan nodded. "Books used to scare me. But Bear, he makes it feel like they're not judging me. Like it's just between us." Kevin didn't answer right away. He unlocked the door and waited until Logan climbed in. Then he said, "Your mom always said stories were how we remember the things that matter." Logan didn't reply, but he held on to those words. He kept writing. At school, his teachers saw the difference. He raised his hand more often. He asked to share what he'd written. He even helped another student who had trouble reading aloud. The boy who once feared books now offered them like gifts. Meanwhile, Bear became something of a legend. Children drew pictures of him in crayon and posted them on the library wall. One child wrote a thank you letter. "Dear Bear, I didn't like to read, but now I do. You make books feel safe." Local newspapers wrote a small feature on the library's reading dog. The headline read, "From Shelter to Storytime, How One Dog is Helping Kids Find Their Voice." Margaret kept a scrapbook with clippings, photos, and handwritten thank you notes from parents. But the page she looked at most often was the one with a picture of Logan seated cross-legged beside Bear, holding a book titled Sir Bear and the Talking Tree. It was a story Logan had written just the week before. It ended with a boy who used to be afraid of speaking, standing on a hilltop beside his silent companion, telling the world everything he once thought no one wanted to hear. And Bear, of course, listening. Always listening. For months, everything had felt like it was finally falling into place. Logan was reading, writing, smiling. Bear had become more than a library dog. He was a fixture of the community, a quiet source of comfort for the children, and a symbol of second chances. Margaret had even joked once that she should order Bear his own library card. Kevin had started sleeping better. There were still hard days, of course, but they were no longer every day. Then came the Tuesday that undid it all. It had started like any other afternoon. The children's reading hour was in full swing. Logan had just finished reading the latest chapter in his ongoing Sir Bear saga, and was now helping a younger boy sound out words from the Berenstain Bears. Bear, as usual, lay quietly beside them, head resting on his paws, the soft sound of his breath rising and falling. Across the room, a new family had come in, a mother and her daughter, perhaps 5 or 6 years old. They hadn't been part of the program before. The mother was on her phone, speaking in a low voice, clearly distracted, while the little girl wandered freely. At first, no one noticed her making her way toward Bear. He wasn't unfamiliar with children approaching uninvited. He never growled, never jumped. His presence was so calm, so dependable, that even Margaret, who was normally eagle-eyed about boundaries, was focused elsewhere. The little girl reached out and tugged Bear's ear. He flinched but didn't move. Then she poked at his paw, giggling. Bear shifted slightly, still patient, still quiet. But then she reached forward suddenly and yanked the fur near his eye. That's when Bear made a sound, a low, brief ruffle in his throat. Not a bark, not even a growl, just a soft warning, the kind any dog might make when startled, but it was enough. The mother turned, saw her daughter stepping back in surprise, and within seconds her voice was sharp, slicing through the room. "What kind of library lets a pit bull near children?" Heads turned. Logan stood up, unsure of what had just happened. Margaret stepped in, calm but firm, to gather the girl and gently explain that Bear was trained, safe, and had done nothing wrong. But the damage was already spiraling. "I don't care if he's trained," the mother snapped. "Pit bulls are dangerous. That dog threatened my child." Logan's face went pale. He dropped his book. Margaret tried to reason, even offered to file an incident report herself. But within 24 hours, the library board received a formal written complaint. The woman had already posted about the event on a local parenting group online, calling Bear a ticking time bomb and criticizing the library for putting children at risk. The next day, Margaret received a call from the head librarian. Though reluctant, they had to act. Bear would need to be removed from the reading program. Effective immediately. That evening, Bear was taken back to the county shelter. Logan had not been told ahead of time. He had arrived at the library with a new story, one he had titled Sir Bear and the Windless Mountain. The book was in his backpack, along with a drawing he had made of Bear wearing a knight's helmet made of silver construction paper. When he walked in and saw the empty blanket in the corner where Bear always lay, he froze. Margaret approached him slowly. her hands shaking. "Logan, sweetheart." But Logan had already dropped his backpack. His face crumpled, his chest heaved. He let out a cry, not a whimper, not a sniffle, but the kind of raw, choking sob that belongs only to someone who has lost something vital. "No!" he screamed. "No! No! No!" Margaret knelt beside him, but Logan pushed away, running out the front doors before anyone could stop him. Kevin found him sitting on the curb near the parking lot, arms wrapped around his knees, shaking. That night Logan didn't speak, not during dinner, not at bedtime. Not even when Kevin read him one of the old stories his mother used to love. The boy who had found his voice through books and a dog had returned to the same silence that once held him prisoner. Days passed. Logan refused to go back to the library. He wouldn't read, he wouldn't write. His notebook sat untouched on his desk, the pages growing colder each day. Kevin tried everything. New books, games, trips to the park, but nothing reached him. One morning, Margaret suffered a mild stroke. The stress of it all, the guilt, the heartbreak, had taken a toll. She was taken to the hospital and placed under observation. Kevin visited her that evening and sat beside her hospital bed in stunned silence. "I didn't even see it coming," she whispered. "It all happened so fast." Kevin clenched his jaw. "He lost more than a dog, Margaret." She looked at him with tired eyes. "I know." At the next community board meeting, Kevin stood to speak. He wasn't someone who normally addressed crowds. His voice had always belonged more to engines and wrenches than microphones. But when he stepped to the front of the room, he spoke clearly, slowly, every word carrying weight. "My son doesn't just have trouble reading. He lost his mother. He lost his light. And the only thing that brought him back was that dog." There was a pause. He glanced at the paper he'd written his notes on, then set it aside. Bear didn't growl. He didn't attack. He reacted the way any living thing does when it's prodded and pulled. But because of how he looks, because of what people think they know, he's now back in a cage. He took a breath. My son didn't just lose a friend. He lost the one thing that pulled him out of the dark. No one spoke for a long time after Kevin sat down. Because there are moments when truth doesn't need to be argued. It only needs to be said out loud. The snow had been falling since late morning, slow at first, soft flakes brushing windows like gentle knocks. But by mid-afternoon, the wind picked up and the calm turned cruel. Schools dismissed early. Shops closed. Weather alerts lit up phone screens across the county. Kevin came home from work to find the house quiet, unnaturally so. Logan's boots were missing from the mat. The back door hadn't been shut all the way. At first, he assumed Logan had just stepped out. Maybe to the neighbors, maybe down the block. But 10 minutes passed, then 20, and with each moment of silence, Kevin's heartbeat sped into panic. He called Logan's name through the yard. He called again in the street. No answer. Kevin phoned the neighbors. No one had seen him. He checked the park, the bus stop. Still nothing. By the time he called the police, the snow was falling hard enough to blur the street signs. Flashlights cut through white sheets of wind. A search party was formed, and officers began canvassing the woods near the town's edge, where Logan sometimes walked with his mother long ago. Kevin clutched his flashlight with shaking hands, his voice cracking as he called into the trees. "He's 8, he told the officer beside him. "He's 8, and he's out there alone." The sky darkened too quickly. Snow erased tracks almost as fast as they were made. It became harder to see, harder to breathe, and harder to imagine anything except the cold settling into his son's skin. Across town, at the county animal shelter, Bear was pacing. He hadn't eaten much in days, but tonight was different. His breathing was fast, ears pinned back. He circled his kennel over and over, stopping only to claw at the door. Then came the sound, the low, rising whine that cracked into a full howl, the kind that raised goosebumps. The kind of sound a dog makes when he feels something wrong and can't tell anyone what it is. Anna, a young staff member, had just started her overnight shift. She recognized Bear immediately, had been there the day he arrived, had seen the way he used to curl up at the window without making a sound. But now, Bear wasn't silent. He was frantic. Anna walked over, crouched down, tried to soothe him. "Easy, buddy. It's just a storm." But Bear didn't stop. He barked loud and deep, not at her, but at the door, again and again, as if willing it to open. As if needing her to understand. Anna hesitated. She glanced at the cameras, the emergency number taped to the wall. Then she made a decision. She grabbed a leash and clipped it to Bear's collar. "I swear if I get fired for this," she muttered. The moment the latch opened, Bear bolted, not to escape, not aimless. He had a direction, a purpose. Anna struggled to keep up as Bear charged through the snow-covered lot, down the back trail behind the shelter toward the woods. Back at the search site, the teams had started to lose hope. The snow was nearly knee-deep now. Visibility was next to nothing. Kevin's voice was hoarse from shouting. One officer placed a hand on his shoulder. "We'll keep looking. But we may need to regroup and wait for first light." Kevin shook his head, refusing to hear it. And then, far off, from beyond the bend in the trees, a bark. Loud, insistent, and unmistakable. Another voice called out, "That's a dog!" Kevin didn't wait for permission. He ran toward the sound, heart pounding, legs burning. He stumbled through branches, slipped once, caught himself. The barking grew louder, sharper, urgent. Then he saw them. Bear was standing near a rocky outcrop, digging at a small mound of snow with his front paws. He barked once more, then began nudging his nose into the snow. Kevin dropped to his knees beside him, clawing with bare hands. There, under a blanket of white, curled into himself like a child in bed, was Logan. His face was pale, lips tinged blue, eyes shut tight. His breathing was shallow, but there, Kevin let out a sound that was half sob, half prayer. "I've got you, buddy. I've got you." The rescue team was there, moments later, wrapping Logan in heat blankets, checking his pulse, shielding his small body from the wind. One medic radioed the hospital, another thanked Bear out loud as if he understood. Bear didn't move far. He sat just beside Logan's feet, as close as the rescuers would allow, his head lowered, body still, tail curled, watching. It had been hours since Logan had walked into the snow alone, drawn by memory, by grief, by the one place he'd last felt safe. A quiet old shed near the woods, the place where he used to read to Bear. Maybe he thought Bear would be there. Maybe he simply wanted to be somewhere that still held a piece of the past. And it was Bear, against all logic, all odds, who found him. Kevin leaned down and pressed his forehead to the dog's. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice shaking. "You saved my boy." Bear didn't answer. He didn't have to. Logan opened his eyes after 2 full days in the hospital, blinking up at the soft light filtering through the curtain. The first thing he felt was warmth, not from a blanket, but from the gentle pressure of something resting at the side of his bed. Bear. The dog's fur was still matted with melted snow, a hospital blanket draped loosely over his back. His eyes were half closed, but he was awake, watching, waiting. When Logan stirred, Bear shifted, letting out a soft breath. Logan turned his face toward him, lifting one trembling hand to place on Bear's shoulder. No words were exchanged, but something passed between them, something that had no need for sound. In the following days, Logan slowly recovered, and so did the town. News of Bear's rescue spread quickly, first through social media, then the local papers, and finally the evening news. A headline read, "Dog saves boy who once saved him." Reporters came, but Margaret refused interviews. "This isn't about a miracle dog," she told them. It's about a friendship that never needed words. Still recovering from her mild stroke, Margaret insisted on attending the town's appreciation ceremony when it was announced. Held at the library, the event was modest but heartfelt. Balloons lined the entrance and paper paw prints decorated the hallway walls. Children drew pictures of Bear in superhero capes and knight armor. One banner read, "Thank you for listening, Bear." A special section of the library was decorated with Bear's favorite blanket, a framed photo of him with Logan, and a collection of children's books with chewed corners and wrinkled pages. At the center of it all sat Logan, freshly dressed in a button-up shirt, still a little pale but smiling. When the time came, the head librarian took the mic and cleared her throat. "We are gathered today not just to honor a brave dog," she said, "but to celebrate what happens when we choose to listen to each other, to our children, and even to the quiet ones with 4 legs." She gestured toward Logan. "This young man has something he'd like to share." Logan stood up, holding a small booklet in his hands. His voice was calm, clear, steady, the voice of someone who had once been afraid to speak at all. "This is the first story I ever wrote," he said. "I was scared to read it out loud back then." But Bear didn't laugh. He didn't correct me. He just listened. "So I want to read it now. For him." He took a breath and began. "Once upon a time, there was a silent knight. He didn't wear armor or carry a sword. He didn't talk much, but he had the biggest heart in the kingdom. When the prince lost his voice and wandered into the woods, the knight followed. He didn't shout. He didn't run. He just walked quietly beside the prince every day until the prince started talking again. That's when the silent knight wagged his tail. The room was completely still. A few people wiped away tears. Kevin, standing behind his son, had both hands clasped tightly in front of him. Margaret, in her wheelchair near the front, reached out to hold his arm. Logan finished the story and looked down at Bear, who sat loyally beside him, calm and proud. He smiled and said, "Bear doesn't speak, but he hears me when I can't hear myself." After the applause, the mayor approached the podium. In a warm, sincere voice, she made an announcement. "From this day forward," she said, "this corner of the library will be known as Bear's Story Nook, a place where children can read, speak, imagine, and know they are safe, no matter what their voice sounds like." The plaque was revealed moments later, a bronze engraving of Bear lying beside an open book with the inscription, "In honor of Bear, who taught us the power of listening." Margaret wept. Kevin wept. Even some of the library staff, hardened by years of overdue books and budget meetings, found themselves dabbing their eyes. Later that week, Logan returned to his writing desk at home. He pulled out a fresh notebook and began working on a new story. But before he did, he opened the final page of his very first book, the one he'd written when everything had just begun. There, in bold handwriting, he had once scribbled a single sentence. "If you can't read to anyone, read to a dog." Now, just beneath it, he added something more. "And if you find the right dog, he'll teach you how to tell your own story." Bear lay beside the desk, as always. His ears twitched at the sound of the pen scratching across the page, but he didn't move. He knew this rhythm by heart now. Logan reached down and stroked his head gently. No words were needed. None ever were. As you've seen, love doesn't always speak. Sometimes it just listens. Logan's journey and Bear's quiet strength remind us that the most profound connections often need no words, only presence, patience, and a little bit of faith. The soul is healed by being with children, wrote Fyodor Dostoevsky, and perhaps also by being with dogs. If this story moved your heart, if it made you cry, smile, or believe again, please subscribe to this channel. Your support helps us keep telling stories that matter. And now, we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever been changed by an animal's love? Tell us your story in the comments. We read every one of them.